Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ariana Wells. I'm the Senior Outreach Manager at the Organization for Responsible Governance, or ORG. I just want to say thank you for tuning in to this roundtable discussion where our theme today is ensuring access to environmental information in the digital age. But before we get into it, let me tell you a little bit more about ORG. So we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that promotes the principles of good governance. We do this by promoting laws that are in the best interest of the people that they're meant to serve. We create bridges for government and citizen communication. We build capacity for other nonprofit organizations like ourselves to meet their strategic goals. And we lead grassroots education programs that help people to understand the important role that they play in society. So, our overall goal is to create greater social and economic opportunities for Bahamians by helping people to get informed and get involved in civic life, which is why we're here today to help build the capacity for people to understand the Freedom of Information Act, which was passed in 2017, and it's meant to grant Bahamians the right to access information, but it has been delayed in this enactment. And we want to connect FOIA to the more recent ESCAZU agreement, which grants access to environmental information. Both FOIA and the ESCAZU are tools for inclusive governance and sustainable development. And ORG, as a facilitator of these dialogues, of course, had to bring together some of the leaders in this field to discuss and share their knowledge and expertise during our Access to Information Week. So, panelists, I want to say thank you for joining us and welcome. Can we start with some introductions, please?
Sure. Rashad Rolle here. I'm the news editor of the Tribune newspaper.
Thanks, Rashad.
Rachel Scott. I'm a reporter with the Nassau Guardian.
Rashema Ingraham, the Caribbean Program Director for Bonefish and Tarpon Trust, and I've been in the environmental space as a conservationist for over 10 years.
Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Ancilleno Davis. I am the owner of the Science and Perspective brand. I'm a professor of environmental science and sustainability at the University of the Bahamas, and I sit on national technical committees for environmental protection, as well as social responsibility, which both tie into the work that ORG is doing here today.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm really excited to explore how access to information helps to protect our environment, helps to strengthen our media, and benefit communities socially and economically. So, welcome again. And let's just get started by getting a broader understanding of why access to information is critical for protecting our environment and our natural resources. Dr. Ancilleno, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, I think that would be great. In most of my work, I deal with sustainability. So I split it into three sectors. There's social, economic, and environmental sustainability. And if we had free access to information related to the environment, we could determine the social sustainability, which groups are disenfranchised or empowered by the laws and legislations that we have on the books, by the decisions that are being made. We have the economic empowerment because you would have information about what your resources are actually worth, who's looking into exploiting those resources, and how the resources that you have might be impacted, and how that affects your bottom line as a human that uses the environment day to day, as a fisher, as a guide, as a bird watcher. And then, of course, there's the environmental sustainability. Ultimately, if there were no banks, if there were no financial institutions, we would still have the sandbanks, right? So we would want to have those available for us to get the resources that we want, for us to be able to feed our family, even if we can't buy a new device or some flashy clothes and stuff like that. So making sure that we can account for the social, economic, and environmental sustainability hinges on us having good access to information.
Yeah, I think there may be an example where access to information has helped to prevent environmental harm or maybe has supported conservation efforts.
You did break up for me just now. If you could repeat the question, please.
No problem. So just building off of what you were saying, I was asking Rashema if she would share some experiences or examples that she's had where access to information has helped to prevent environmental harm.
Yeah, thank you for repeating the question because you did break up for a bit.
No worries.
Yeah. So just thinking about the overall question that was asked and the fact that we are fortunate to be in a democratic country, knowing that rights of the people is strongly tied into our constitution, and knowing that we as individuals have certain rights to be citizens of the Bahamas. It's something that not every citizen of a country in the world can say. And to know that we have at least a Freedom of Information Act, although it is not fully implemented, it says that our government structure exists so that people are to be aware, or people should be able to access information. So this is an important tool when it comes to governance, and this is one of the things that org has definitely been pushing. Other organizations have been pushing in the past. I think it was done alongside Save the Bays initially. So it's good to see that org is continuing to push these efforts. What is absent, though, is that full enactment of the Freedom of Information Act. And although baby steps, at least we are getting there. And hopefully we're getting there without that false sense of transparency, and that we're being very serious about it. With that said, though, going to your question about which recent environmental concern comes to mind is the development in North Bimini, where many of the conservationists, many of the groups, many of the activists at the time were very vocal about some of the damaging effects that the development would have on some of the well-known dive sites in Bimini, the impact that it will have on sand movement. And what it would do for the small island, and whether or not a project of that size would be able to be managed by the people, as well as whether or not the environmental pressures would cause a shift in the ecosystems around it. This example is not a good one because even though we had access to information, people were able to publicly state their opinions, the development was still able to carry through to a certain point. And we are now at a point where time has gone, and we can now see the effects of the project. And we can now see that maybe the size of it wasn't right, maybe the location, maybe some of the approval processes weren't right. So I think that is the best case study that we can use right now for us as a country to see if we really need to fully enact stronger environmental enforcement, not laws, because we have a lot of it and really good ones, of enforcement, and whether or not more access needs to be available to the people, whether it's the citizens or those who are in government agencies or public spaces to be able to make better decisions for the environment.
Right. Before we move on, because I want to come back to a few of the points that you made, but I want to hear from one of our media people about what exactly, what role does the media really play when we talk about our democratic rights and democracy?
Yeah, so I would say when you think about democracy, it has a lot to do with our choices in terms of what we decide to do politically. And the ideal is that you want citizens who are informed. If you're going to exercise your right to choose, say, your party of choice, You want to make sure that people are as informed as they could possibly be. And that's where the media comes in. It is our job to provide information to the public that allows them to make the right choices. I think sometimes we see ourselves as a go-between between, powerful political structures and the people that rely on them to find solutions to everyday needs. I also feel as though sometimes information from experts, for instance, can be very technical. And the media's responsibility oftentimes is to try and break that down and simplify it so that the public can understand it, consume it in a way that then allows them to make the best decisions.
So you talked a bit about kind of strengthening collaboration between people and media, but I'm wondering what other ways can we strengthen the collaboration between the government, the media, and civil society to maximize some of the benefits of accessing information?
Well, I think one of the things that is important is more community engagement from the media's perspective or the media standpoint. I think a lot of reporters, we only go to the public when it's time to write a story or when it's time to broadcast the news. I think the future or one of the ideals is a situation where, members of the press can have meetings with members of the public to better understand what their needs are or better understand what they feel about media and try to figure out how they can help them. And I feel as though that's where organizations like org can play a very useful kind of mediator role or facilitator role in that kind of thing.
I'll just jump in here quickly as well. I think one of the, as Rashad said, so much of our job is breaking down information that the average person, they're busy. It's not their job to do that. It's our job to take information that's not easily digestible and make it easily digestible, make it accessible, and also to keep track of, promises of pledges and be able to hold authorities accountable. Whereas the average person, you can go out and protest on Bay Street. That takes a lot of organizing. That takes a lot of expecting just an average person or a group of average people to be on top of these things where, like I said, it's just not their job to do it. It's our job to do it. And I think when it comes to access to information, this is something that I'm sure Rashad and I both have covered extensively over the years, because it's been something like a decade that we've had a Freedom of Information Act and it hasn't been fully enforced. And one of the challenges that I think we all identify is that people don't, the average member of the public still doesn't, I don't think, identify access to information as a key issue for them when it comes time to go to the polls, when it comes time to make these decisions. Even though we write the stories in the paper, I think there's still a disconnect where people say, well, I'm concerned about my job. I want to have employment. I want to be able to afford groceries. I want to be able to send my children to a decent school. I'm afraid of crime. And they don't really, and I think information is a key to all these issues, because information is how how the government is allocating its resources to deal with these issues. It's fundamental. But a lot of people don't understand that because there's not a direct connection between access to information in their day-to-day lives. And then I think we as the journalists, we try and write these stories. It's not important to people. It doesn't get on the front page every single time you write it because it's not important to people. Or not to the average reader. They're looking for something that seems more just overtly interesting. And it kind of gets into a bad cycle, I think, where it becomes that much harder to make those connections. And so I think that's something that is a little bit difficult to combat. But I think some of it does come down to being, as journalists, being able to tell these stories in a way that makes them a little bit more interesting, where you make these connections. You put a lot of background into the story. You say, why is this important? We know why it's important, but sometimes the person who picked up the paper from the newsstand on the side, they're not going to care unless you lay that out for them. And so I think there's some things that we can be more mindful of as we try to navigate these issues.
I just wanted to, sorry, could I jump in here and just clarify some stuff? For me, as an environmental scientist, I understand that a lot of my work, I could be in the depths of some really bad environmental stuff going on. But my job as an environmentalist, like a journalist, is really to tell the truth in that situation, to show this angle of the truth and connect it for people. What we do see sometimes, and right now we're coming into campaign season, right? So we're going to get a lot of what I call the filters and the flavors. And so even as an environmental scientist, I can provide information to the media, but if it's accepted, it can often be filtered through, who's the target audience? Is this something that's just important for people in Bimini? Is this something that's important for people throughout the Bahamas? Is it important for certain people because their prime minister is involved in this deal? Or is it important for certain people because their minister of parliament is involved in this deal? So certain people have that interest and they will filter out what's of interest to them and not. And then you get the flavors. And when I say flavors, it's like sometimes you could present environmental information, but then when you see it come out in a newspaper article or on a social media post, one person will say 500 gallons were spilled into the Sound in Eleuthera. Another person will say the Lutheran beach was destroyed by these gallons of whatever chemical. And another person will say, oh, there was an accidental spill in Eleuthera that's being treated. So sometimes you have those filters and flavors that we have to deal with. And for myself as a scientist, I'm trying to get the full information out there. And then as a citizen, I'm reading some things and I could look at 3 different newspapers and get 3 different angles on the story, right? And so what I think I would like to hear from my colleagues in the journalism space, how do we give you all the information in a way that we could avoid that happening or make sure that it's the information is treated in the way that we need it to be?
Well, Rashad probably is better to speak about this since he's an editor. But I will say, I think it's always been my view that every reporter, no matter how you try to remove personal bias from it, the way that you craft your story, the hook that you find in it, the thing that makes it newsworthy is really going to depend on the reporter and also things that have been in the news, things that have already been deemed newsworthy. And so I think that's just one of those things that's going to exist to a certain extent. I mean, I think we try to report scientific things as straightforwardly as we can, especially when we get something like a report. But you are always looking for something that's going to be, the most interesting thing to put at the top of your story. And everyone's going to choose that most interesting thing differently in a lot of cases. So I think that's why you see the difference. Now, when you talk about social media pages, where they're not, official news agencies, then I think they take a few more liberties with how they're able to take more liberties with how they present or sensationalize information. And I think that's a challenge that we face, is competing with those social media pages as well, that don't have to vet their information as thoroughly. But I'll let Rashad give his thoughts.
Yeah, so what I would say, my question would be, you mentioned that you would see 3 different flavors or 3 different approaches to writing the story. And my first question would be, are any of those statements or reports inaccurate? Like, is it a case where the reporter has reported something that, in your view as a scientist, is fundamentally wrong or misrepresents the research or the point that was being made? Because if that's the case, then that is clearly an error or failure on the part of the news institution. And ideally, you would want a situation where the scientist reaches out to that news entity and explains that they are reporting something that is inaccurate. And news entities are to be responsible enough to issue corrections and make changes. But to get to the point that Rachel mentioned, reporters are in the business of trying to engage readers. And sometimes scientific research and information can be very esoteric. And as people who are in this business of trying to figure out what will interest readers, we sometimes can look at a piece of scientific research and could tell that if we write this exactly the way it's written, people aren't going to engage in it. They aren't going to read it. So you will have reporters who will read that research or who will listen to the interview that you give and decide this is the most interesting way to present this information. And I don't think there's anything wrong if you have 3 different news organizations reporting that in a different way or highlighting something different, so long as it's accurate. If it's a case where they have highlighted something in particular, but you feel as though it's not comprehensive enough, because that often happens. I think scientists feel as though we shortchange them with some of the stories and don't go into sufficient depth. Then I would like to see a situation where there's enough engagement between the news institution and the scientists where, you could bridge that gap.
Yeah, and I think just adding on to that, I think there are probably also, or the thing that I, sometimes recommend to people is a news article, especially for our papers, generally can only be so long. So when you're breaking down a 100-page report, which sometimes is the case, and you're reading that, you're digesting it, you're writing it in the same day, you're not going to get everything in. But I think in that case, sometimes it's helpful to have a conversation with the people who are writing in the opinion section of the paper or the editorial section, because that's where you get a chance to flesh out issues in a little bit more depth. A lot of the time for The Guardian, we had National Review for a long time, and Candia, who writes that, would usually take that as an opportunity to write more in-depth pieces on, issues of note. So I would say greater collaboration could maybe help with that a little bit, where you can use alternative routes, just not only the national section of the paper where the articles can only be so long, but building these relationships where you can have multiple articles from the same report if we are made aware that you feel like we didn't flesh something out adequately.
Yeah, so I was just like absorbing all of the comments, all of the thoughts that were being shared. And one of the things that stood out to me was knowing that most professionals, they have an oath, an oath to act a certain way, to interact with the public a certain way. And I'm sure that journalists do so as well. Same for lawyers, same for doctors. We may not know that publicly, but I'm sure there's an oath to perform, an oath for your duty. One of the things you said, Rachel, was, to be that middle person for the community. And I thought, no way. I see journalists or media people actually being the lead, especially when it comes to providing information to the public. And I say that because I know for us as conservationists, as scientists, we look for the papers to see when a battle is going to happen between a developer and the environmental community or some activists. Like it goes down in the media. Like, so that's when a story is hot, we know we either listen to the news broadcast that evening, or we look for the papers first thing in the morning, because that's where the story is going to be told. That's where either the information is going to be shared because we know we're going to get some level of traction, that you're going to go out and seek to get the facts. You're going to go out and seek support or information from both sides, or all three sides, or how many other sides there is. So we expect journalists to act in a certain way. We expect you to come to the scientists, to come to the environmentalists, to get our sides of the story, to take whatever large of a word that we use, or Dr. Lino throws at you, and break it down to the public, and not to use large words like esoteric uh, in the media, because you've already narrowed down your sample size, because you know that the larger number of people already are going to be turned off by reading through or hearing that word. And I think we saw a great example of that from one of the world's largest leaders just this week, not knowing how to be able to say a word, and then it causes mass confusion. That's something that we don't want journalists to do. We don't want journalists to confuse the public, because we still want our stories to be told. And we know that this is the base for us to get before, at times, the regulatory people or the decision makers to do something about what's to be done. So when development happens, we know that at times, because enforcement is a huge issue, although there are avenues to correct that, that enforcement is a big issue in our country. Once it gets in the media or in the public space, and we don't want it to always be on social media, we want it to be in the Guardian, we want it to be on our news, we want it to be in the Tribune. That's where we want it to be, so that when we go to pull those gazettes and use them in court documents, and use them in whatever legislative avenue that we can use, we want it to be from official news sources. So we are relying heavily on you to be the voice for us. And so I don't want you to ever downplay your role in these issues.
Yeah, and I just wanted to touch on two things that were brought up just now. The first is, I think Rashad, in your discussion, talking about like when something is incomplete, is it inaccurate, right? Or if they present a certain flavor to the news, did they say something that's inaccurate? And one of the things that we really work against in science is bias. And so if there's a whole picture that is available and you consistently provide one side of it, then that becomes bias, right? If you always look to the right, if you always look to the left, then that becomes bias. But you can have an incomplete picture that's not biased by saying, you know, these are some of the key points. Every development that has shown up in the Bahamas always has 500 jobs. How come you could have this huge development and this tiny development, they both only need 500 people to make it? Like that could be incomplete, but then if you show the public, hey, this is where you can find the rest of the information. And a lot of times I actually do not see that in the media, where coverage in your articles actually includes the links to the original, right? And that is a type of scientific practice that we have. But sometimes you have these announcements for like a public meeting that's in an ad. And when you go to search for the references on your media websites, we actually can't find those ads, although we might find your reference to the meeting that occurred. And so it's difficult for us sometimes when we are challenging these things and we're saying, you know, when did you present this meeting would be available? The initial advertisement of the meeting is actually mandated by the law and policy. But if we don't have that recorded in a way that you can access it through our gazettes, that becomes a challenge for us in your online searches, for example. And then the timeliness. And I think that's the challenge. Rashema was saying that a lot of times we don't know that this thing is going to happen or it's going to be an environmental problem. As environmental scientists, we don't have access to the information until one of your writers who's just covering what the MP is doing, and that MP happens to be on this private island looking at this significant development. And then the environmentalists are like, hey, y'all see this that's going on? Have any of you seen the EIA related to this? So we come in on the back end from the citizen side, right? We're a citizen that reads your paper. And our first access to this information is through your paper. And then we have to backtrack and see if any of us actually got the original information that needs to advise that. And so that timeliness is super important, as well as the completeness of the access to the information. And the value of the media in that is so potent. And Rashema is part of the Beings Network that I started about 15 years ago, and is Bahamians educated in natural and geospatial sciences. And we actually have a Beings press box. And so within the Nassau Guardian, within the Tribune, and our news and Eyewitness, we actually have different members of those different media houses who are in that WhatsApp group. And we regularly share different environmental impacts or activities and stuff. But we also feel like it doesn't trickle through. Like there might be certain writers who are in there, but if they don't feel it at that time or they have other deadlines, they might not pick up the story, you know? So maybe if y'all could give us some idea of how do we get it into your machinery? How do we get that information into that to disperse it better?
In y'all's group. So you can add me. But I do think, like I said, I mean, there are gonna be things that get filtered on foot. I mean, all our papers, there are a lot of things at play, but all of us have been short-staffed in recent years for the Guardian. I know for a long time. We do have 4 p.m. deadlines every day. And sometimes it does come down to I have 3 or 4 stories to write today. Like this one just came in at 3 o'clock. This ain't making it today. And then you forget about it or something else comes up and then it's a week later and it's old. And so not making excuses, but I do think things like that happen. And so it probably is beneficial to add as many reporters as possible to that group, because chances are on any given day, there's someone looking for a story. And then obviously not everything is going to necessarily make the newspaper. You might pitch it to your editor and they say, yeah, we're not really too into that, but it increases your chances.
Okay.
So I definitely appreciate that the conversation took this direction, because one, you're answering a lot of the questions that I have for you, but also it seems like there's a lot of alignment and opportunity for you all to collaborate. But I want to go back to what Rachel was saying earlier and kind of connect it back to how do we make this relevant for the everyday Bahamian who is fighting to put groceries on the table, fighting to make sure their kids get to school and get an education. It's hard to take things that are considered to be more abstract or esoteric and connect it back to the people and help them to recognize that this is cyclical. And what happens, these governance processes, what happens there and what happens in government, what happens in these institutions, they're happening on your behalf and they affect you. How do we actually get people to understand that access to information is critical?
So, oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Rachel.
You sure? Okay. So this is something that just me personally as a journalist, I kind of struggle with, because, and I'm sure Rashad can relate, right? So you're a journalist, that's your job. And then you go home and you hear from your parents, from your auntie, from your cousin, I saw this on Facebook and y'all ain't covering this, y'all ain't checking. How come this isn't in the Guardian and this is on this place? And so you take a lot of beating from people about the things that you don't cover. And like I said, that's when I say, well, those Facebook pages, they don't have to vet their information. They're anonymous. They can post anything. They're probably not going to jail for it. I can't say the same for myself if I write something with unvetted information. And in many cases, these juicy stories, these deep unearthings of like scandalous information, we often only get that information in our current environment because we don't have a framework like a Freedom of Information Act that is functional. We only get that through our personal relationships. And so you need someone to leak that information to you, right? So it could be that someone is disgruntled and they leak it to the media. They don't know any of us and they leak it because they're disgruntled. They might leak it anonymously. They feel like there was some injustice. But a lot of the time, it's that you have a personal relationship with someone in a position of authority because of your role as a journalist and having interacted with them over the months, years, whatever. And they leak that information for whatever their motive could be. And their motive could be any range of things. It could be because they're a good person and, it's about ethics and morality. It could be because there are internal politics at play, and it might, serve them, or they feel that it might serve them to make someone else who would be implicated to get that out there into the public. And then when we get that, we have to go through a very extensive process of making sure that it's even accurate. You can't just write it and not know what you're writing. And then someone says that you lied or you said something that was inaccurate and it caused them personal damage. And so we have to go through this long list of things. And then to top it off, like I said, we just do not have access. We don't have guaranteed access to information. We can't put in a Freedom of Information request and expect that there's a reasonable chance that we might get an answer in the next decade. It doesn't exist. And so when I explain this to people, I'm like, yeah, so when your MP comes to your door ahead of the next election, you want these things in the paper, tell them that you want a Freedom of Information not fully enforced, but it's still it goes through one ear and goes out the next for a lot of people, because I think it comes off like I'm ranting, but it does get frustrating because you're trying to do a job that's very difficult to do without the tools that you need to do it.
I saw that Rashad's mic was open, so I wasn't sure if you wanted to chime in on this as well.
Oh, no, you can.
Okay. What I wanted to say to that question, Ari, was the fact that you're gonna have just a handful of people who are going to go to government websites or into the actual government office to find out information. You're not going to have many people who are going to do that. So most people will want that information to be delivered to them, just like how they want milk delivered to their door, right? So they want it available to them when they're ready for it. For us, I think that the media at this time has more access than we do. Like, they're invited to certain events, they're invited into certain spaces. So their access or availability of information is much greater than ours. And like Rachel said, you may have somebody who has a close connection to them who shares information regularly. So certain journalists will get stories daily. So that leaves us again to the point that I was making, waiting on information, and it could be a day old information. Whether or not that's something that we want to see continue, no, because I believe that we're going now on 3 successive governments who have said that they were going to implement the Freedom of Information Act, or they were going to fully implement the Freedom of Information Act. And so we're here with twiddled thumbs waiting on that to all happen. But everybody should be able to write to every government office and say, can you provide information for me related to this? And the clock ticks the minute that letter of request is submitted to that office, where they have a limited time to be able to respond to that letter. That's what the law is providing, to be able to provide a timeline for us. But on pressing matters, that timeline is still going to put too much time and space in between whether or not that person gets the response. So again, the journalist's story is so critical, so key. So it leaves people who are wondering whether or not the removal of mangroves from a particular waterway is going to impact the migration of bonefish, which will then impact my livelihood because I depend on that. And my grandmother depends on the visitors to my lodge to come now and visit on an annual basis so that she is able to have an overturn in her inventory in her small convenience store in a small community in the Bahamas. So looking at the whole socioeconomic chain now that's happening because one person asks whether or not this developer got the approval needed to move mangroves, and we're still not sure what that answer is. And the fact that that has not been answered because 90 days has passed, 365 days have passed. Nobody has covered the story because there is not a MP attached to it, or we're not in the political time of the year or time within the country where headlines on mangrove removal will then make sense for a small community of voters. Like these are the things that we are dealing with regularly, where we have, again, the sensationalized stories that will give you better headlines, and the fact that you have the opportunity to tell stories that can hit communities, that can hit people's pocket, that can talk to their daily lives, and then also knowing that we are still waiting on the Freedom of Information Act. So it's so much when we talk about these types of conversation, it's so much around it that it can take us so much time to address. Um, uh, and it's unfortunate that we have to go to Facebook because we would have never known at times that these things are happening if we didn't have Facebook. And sometimes for us, if we didn't have Facebook, the journalists wouldn't respond. So I thank Facebook, I thank social media, I thank WhatsApp, although they may be a little excessive at times with the way that they tell the story, but at least it's out there.
I think in this, I like what y'all brought up before, like as a journalist, Rachel, you go home and you can't put down your responsibilities as a journalist because someone's going to come and tell you something that's happening and they expect you to cover this story, or you covered a story and now I can just imagine the amount of flack you get when you come out, but why you didn't say this, or why you didn't say that, and why you didn't cover this side of the story, and why you didn't go by this person to get their information. As environmentalists, I have to tell you, I have everything in my WhatsApp from my colleagues telling me that there's a snake on campus to someone telling me that there's an oil spill or there's a barge stuck on a sandbank by Abaco right now. And I understand how overwhelming it gets as well, right? And how do we balance this? But then also like you have that level of, we have some professional access to things. Like if either of you like messaged me and asked me for a quote on environmental legislation related to forests or something like that, right? I wouldn't expect you as a journalist to have studied all of those documents. I don't expect you as a journalist with 5 different stories to cover to have read a 500 or 600-page environmental impact assessment. But that is what I do. So like when you guys reach out to me, like those are things that I can say, maybe I don't have it all for you right now, but these are some of the points that I can pull out. So you can rely on us. Like I said, I'll be happy to add both of you actually to the Beings Press box. And I think that will give you some major access that you may not have had before. But I also would like to touch touch on this thing about our perception, because like Rashema said, like we're not invited to everything. I know that I'm not invited to some things because I'm going to tell the truth. I'm going to tell you how bad something is for the environment. So if they don't want to hear that at that point in time, I might not be invited into that meeting. But as an agent of the press, maybe, I don't know how it works for you all, but maybe you have events where you are specifically invited to that. And sometimes it might be nice for you to even report on who was not in the room, right? Um, and sometimes it's like, it's very obvious when you have a town hall meeting and there is no Eric Carey, there's no Eleanor Phillips, there's no Rashema Ingraham or Ancilleno Davis in the room. And there's only the government agent, the developer, and the environmental organization who's doing the work for the developer. So when you get in situations like that, these are things sometimes that I think if you guys interact with us some more, you can see what we're looking at and what we're calling out regularly, and even doing some analysis on what you have actually shown in your papers in the past. And we have a database that we developed for Our Islands, Our Future, that actually highlights a lot of the environmental publications from the different newspapers in the country, and it's very telling, like whose name pops up regularly, which islands are getting hit by these environmental stuff. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to collaborate, and I'm looking forward to it. I'm excited to have you all at this table today, and I thank Org for like bringing us together for this. This is fun for me.
And it's fun for us too. Like, our role is really as the facilitator. I'm glad that we can facilitate this dialogue. But just in the interest of time, I do want us to go back to just understanding FOIA, because we've all seen the delays and the impacts that the delays of FOIA has had. But I want to connect that to the ESCAZU and what is really the significance of this new signing? Like, what does this mean for you all in your respective roles?
Well, definitely for people in our space, knowing that we bring a little bit of science, we bring a little bit of conservation, but also knowing that just beyond some of the laws of our country, that our government and our policymakers also see the need to also sign on to international agreements for the protection of conservationists or environmentalists, because they have a duty to serve. They have a duty to share their thoughts or views on certain things that may be happening, and to also have an appreciation for the role that they play in society, knowing that they are a mouthpiece for the protection of certain things, because not all conservationists or activists are in the same space. But they're doing so because they may not necessarily be a member of parliament or a senator or on certain boards where they have that opportunity to be at a table and help to make those decisions, but they want to be able to be a part of that community that gives their opinions, and not to be chastised for it or persecuted or ridiculed or even put to death. But knowing that once they voice their concerns, that there's a level of protection and respect for them to be able to do so.
Yeah, I think I was going to say earlier, I do think that when it comes to environmental issues, and this isn't, I'm not saying that this is perfect at all. I think that we're far from it, but I do think that is actually one of the sectors where we do get a little bit more information because of laws that mandate that for, projects of a certain size, the EIA has to be made public. That's one of the only instances where we get a kind of guaranteed official document with information that's made public. And that is why you see some journalists who, every month they have a story in the paper about the EIA for this project, what it reveals, and it gets these issues. It starts conversations about them. the Escazú agreement signing, I think is a great step forward. I do think that when you've been begging for a Freedom of Information Act for a decade, it kind of seems a little bit just like an incomplete commitment. When you see that resources aren't being allocated to make a broader push towards creating an environment of transparency and access to information, I think that it's, a great step. But I think that I think it's hard for me to imagine, our government truly fulfilling the, I don't know, tenets, I guess, or the things that come with signing on to that agreement when there is no clear, broader commitment to transparency and creating access to other information. Although I do think, like I said, that that the environment in particular is something that we do a little bit better with already.
Yeah, I agree with Rachel. It's hard for me to be particularly optimistic, to be honest, because whether it's with environmental related matters or a host of different things, we see time and time again, legislation is passed, agreements are signed, much to do is made of it, but we don't see the enforcement. Typically, the resources aren't even put in place. I mean, the government passed some significant environmental legislation a few years ago. We have yet to be able to get information, for instance, on penalties for those who have broken provisions of those laws. The Attorney General had made it pretty clear that they just were not going to disclose it. So I'm not even entirely sure if anyone has been held accountable under such a law. So if things that were already in place are being ignored, it's difficult for me to get excited that a new agreement that we have signed on to is going to make a difference. But I think somebody made the point earlier as it relates to getting people to care about access to information. It does seem as though all of us could do a better job of linking freedom of information and access to information to specific examples of how people's lives could improve if they get those information. We know what people really care about in terms of their bottom line. And it seems we have to figure out how to illustrate how when you exist in a society where you have the information and you know what's really happening, this could eventually lead to better decisions being made by policymakers on your behalf. And it can help you better advocate for what's needed.
Right. And this is exactly why we say get informed and get involved at org, but you need to have the information in order to do that, right? But we do have, we've been doing a lot of advocacy around FOIA, as I'm sure all of you know. But we specifically have the FOIA resource hub that we want to continue to push people to and continue to ask people to go and engage with it. It's orgbahamas.com/FOIA hub. And so I would love for you all to take a look. I'm sure many of you are already engaged with it, but for our audience, please feel free to continue to engage with the FOIA Resource Hub. Just in the interest of time, because we are right at the last 2 minutes, but we ran a very brief social media campaign asking our followers if they had specific questions around access to information that they want us to ask. And we did this because, like we were just talking about, we do want to find ways to connect the dots for people to understand why they need access to information. We actually got a few answers. So I selected 2, just in the interest of time, that we can go through. But the first one is, how can we balance ChatGPT's ability to give us access to information with how bad ChatGPT is for the environment? And I thought that that was a great question. I'm really interested to hear you guys respond.
So I'll take that. I actually also sit on the National Technical Committee for Artificial Intelligence now. And when you bring that into terms with how much information there is about the Bahamas and our environment online, but ChatGPT and Google Gemini, they're actually on a lag. So they don't see the information that happened this year with like SpaceX landing spaceships in the Bahamas and not post in the EIA until like a week before. Things like this won't even show up in ChatGPT. So like thinking about how that works, that's really important to balance that. But sometimes the ability for us to get an understanding, a broader understanding quickly, it's worth it. And a lot of the impacts that we see from AI and how it's changing the environment, those are on scales that it won't impact Bahamian people directly, and as significantly as some of these decisions on the environment are like today or tomorrow. So that barge that's on the sandbank in Abaco, the spill from that or whatever leaks from that is going to affect the fish that those people will eat, right? Oil drilling near Grand Bahama when Challenger Energy Group comes to look for oil again, that will affect those people in Grand Bahama who depend on that fishery. And so that might be different, a different threshold of impact that we have to look at. And I find that it's a really interesting question, but we can balance it with trying to answer our questions now and changing the impact into the future as soon as possible.
All right. All right. Does anyone have anything they want to add to that? I think I saw.
Yeah, I
Okay.
also wanted to ask or maybe suggest at the same time, but ask if there are avenues for people of the public to reach out to the media or to reach out to journalists directly, to be able to ask a question or provide information, so that they don't have to necessarily go to an artificial source to seek answers. What makes the internet such a useful tool as well as uh, a nightmare at times is the fact that everybody has it in their hand and it's accessible, or available at the click. Where I could say, Google, I just learned about this Gemini thing, or ChatGPT, help me with this answer. But if I wanted to get a response to a question, or ask a question, or ask if you're covering something, like what is available to me as a citizen for me to reach out to a journalist or to a media house. And also the same for the scientists or the environmentalists. I know that under Dr. Davis, we've done a lot with beings and trying to be able to make us or our group more accessible to people, but I think it should also be available in the space for journalists as well.
Well, I know, I've had people reach out to me because I don't know if I think on our website and in the print version of the paper, it usually gives the Nassau Guardian anyway, gives our personal work email addresses. So I've had people send follow-up emails to stories just directly. I respond depending on how sensible the request is. Because sometimes you get some crazy things sent to you. But so there's kind of a direct channel to reach individual reporters, and then sometimes people call the newsroom. So whoever's the lucky reporter to be sitting in the newsroom when that random call comes in, usually they get to handle that one. So I would say, yeah, call the newspapers, send messages on social media. We all check our social media inboxes. Sometimes that's where you find an interesting story, and email us. Those are probably the most direct ways to get into contact with reporters, in my experience. Rashad can say if he feels different.
No, I agree with you. Like you said, the emails are attached to the bylines in the paper as well as online. Messages can be sent through the social media pages. Facebook is a particular one in relation to that. Otherwise, I think, as was discussed, there's already some groups, WhatsApp groups involving environmentalists. I would like to be added to that. I'm sure you, Rachel, want to be added to that as well. So that's another avenue to access journalists.
And then finally, if I have the chance, I would thank you for the chance. Sorry, I would like to say to not get discouraged, journalists. I know that it's a lot and it's a lot that you have to weed through, but we do appreciate your efforts. We do appreciate what you're doing for the public, also providing the information. Um, Still keep in mind some of the things that we mentioned in terms of bias, and then just that roundabout messaging about a story, but we applaud you, and we hope that you never get discouraged, and to keep reminding them that you signed this and you agreed to that, and we are right here waiting on those answers as well.
Yeah, and I'm definitely going to offer myself personally. So, of course, if you guys want access to the Beings Network, if you want access to the Science and Perspective database, where I've been collecting a lot of these references, the articles, and some things, it's not just like the law of the Bahamas, but it's a treaty, it's a decision at the United Nations and stuff like that, that we want all Bahamians to be able to have access to this. But like you said, you guys translate for us sometimes, and you have the distribution network. So I could go and stand on top of the mountain and shout, but you guys are getting a newspaper on their desk in their office every day. And so that's important for us to acknowledge, I think. And there's definitely just understanding, I think you brought it up, Rashad. There's a lot of legislation already. And the legislation is good in some places, but a lot of the legislation that say there's supposed to be this information created by the Director of Environmental Planning and Protection, the environmental baselines, information like that, who is the environmental professional in the Bahamas. Some of that stuff, maybe you guys in your papers can actually publish that. Maybe you can share information like that, like periodically, like, hey, feature some more Bahamian scientists, some Bahamian environmentalists who have specialties in these different fields. And I know you could probably run 5 years of things just with the Beings Network and the people inside our network. I think there's 250 of us. So once a week, you could have a different environmental scientist featured. So think about that. That's an opportunity. But thank you so much for your contributions and your support in getting the word out.
Yes,
Thank you all so
all.
much.
And I want to echo that and just say to the environmentalists as well, please don't be discouraged. Everyone here is doing incredible work. And if there's ever a way that org could support you all, please know that we're here to continue to do that. We are way over and out of time, but I do want us to leave on one last question, and we can make it very brief, just a key takeaway, something that our audience can just walk away and continue to think about. What are some of the real social and economic benefits that communities have when they have access to information? Very brief from each of you.
I think one of the main things is that you can't demand and you can't ask for what you don't know exists or what you don't know you should have. And when it comes to access to information or what you can get with the resources that need to be allocated. And so when it comes to access to information, we often hear that we can't have certain things because there's not a budgetary allocation for it. We don't have the budget for it. We don't have the money for it. We know that we take in however much revenue, we have however much expenditure generally. But when it comes to information, I think just more, access to information that allows for greater accountability will trickle down into communities and their everyday, day-to-day needs, whether those are social needs, environmental needs, infrastructural. With greater access to information, you can hold people accountable and demand more because you know what you're asking for, and you know what exists.
I think it can even help you in terms of ease of mind. I remember when we had the big Rubis spill in Marathon back in the day, I believe it was like 2012. There were a lot of chemicals that were a part of that, and it was quite scary for a lot of the residents in that constituency. And for a very long time, the administration of the day resisted releasing the information on the impact of that oil spill. When they eventually did, the study claimed that there was not significant health risk posed to the residents. Of course, by then, people had already made up their minds and they had already believed that there was significant risk. But that was a case where, had the government been more upfront and had the information been provided in a more timely manner, a very big controversy could have been avoided, and a lot of the concern that the residents had about the environmental impact of that spill perhaps could have been avoided. Or if there was indeed a hazard or threat, that could have been remediated sooner.
And I think there's Bahamians often don't know what they're losing in comparison to what they're getting. And so in all of these developments, we don't have freedom of information with regards to the environmental baselines, how many fisheries resources we have, how many fishermen are using those resources, how many Bahamians are using the water or swimming in an area versus how that's going to change. Right now, the Samson Key development, they just added a change to their EIA that's going to totally shift the way the water moves inside that that area between those islands. And people haven't been informed of that. There hasn't been back and forth like is typical. We know after Hurricane Dorian, we had a sitting minister of the environment say that only 3 birds, was it 3 birds and 1 goat were impacted, right? And any environmental scientist that you had contacted at that time could have told you that on the island of Grand Bahama, there are hundreds of bird species identified in that forest area. And then they also said at the time that no wetlands were affected. And that was one of the times that I went publicly and I did a quick Google Earth map that could show specifically where the oil went and the wetlands that were impacted. And Waterkeepers Bahamas got me over here shortly after to evaluate. But these types of things, now that you guys are going to be in the Beings Network today, you're going to see the access that you have to really quickly turn around against some of these inaccuracies. And sometimes I understand that journalists quote what a minister says, but then as soon as you get your quote from the minister on anything that's environment related, reach out to us and see what we have to share with you on that.
So I'm just thinking about one of your first questions, Ari, was what positive environmental story occurred, and the fact that access to information, kept it as a positive one. Hopefully after today, and knowing that we are all now connecting, we have a story, an example for you. But as it stands now, we seem to be having stories where it didn't turn out well for the environment. Bimini being one case, the oil spill in Grand Bahama after Hurricane Dorian was another big one. There are many, and there will continue to be many. But thinking about the availability of information and the benefits to the community, what I think about is them now having relevant information, having stats, having a better understanding of law, of enforcement, of what policies or agreements that we sign on to, for them as a community to be able to provide better recommendations to either their local government representatives or their members of parliament, as it relates to town planning or any environmental concerns that they may have, so that they say, as a community of 3,000 people or a community of 500 people, where 80% of the people agree to these recommendations based on the information that we've been able to collect, we would like for you to therefore make decisions or recommendations on our behalf. So I feel like there could be a much stronger voice from a community if they know what they have the right to do, as well as from a community when they know that, again, if we lose this, this can occur, or if we don't protect this, this can happen, and our children will be at a disadvantage. So I see that as being the tool for having access to information and what the community can do to use it usefully, better, and make sounder decisions.
Yes. Yes, definitely. I mean, the key takeaway really is that well-informed communities are more resilient socially, economically, environmentally. People need access to information. They need to know that the things that they don't know, if that makes sense.
Right.
But thank you for those answers. I think that's a great way for us to close out, because I think that last question definitely grounded us in the reality of where we stand as a country. But wow, this dialogue has definitely been very instrumental in helping us understand the critical need for access to information. But also, it's been great to have you all come here and have ideas for how you can collaborate in the very short future. So I'm going to ensure that everyone gets each other's contacts immediately following this discussion. But I just want to say thank you. Thank you so much for having this discussion with us, for taking part in Access to Information Week and being here, for joining us today and sharing all of the expertise that you have. And thank you for the work that you're doing. And also thank you to the audience for tuning in and using this discussion as a resource. I hope that everyone continues to follow along with org as we go through the rest of Access to Information Week. You can follow us on social media at org Bahamas, or you can also reach out to me, Ari, at orgbahamas.com. I'm always open to coming and exploring governance topics with you or your civic group. So please reach out. But anyway, thank you all and have a great day.
Thank you.